What is it that leads a man down the path of involuntary celibacy? There has long been a debate between nature versus nurture, where on the far end of the nature side of the spectrum, you have people arguing that genetics is destiny, or in other words, genetic determinism, which is the idea that the DNA you are born with shapes every single aspect of your life, and your childhood experiences and your upbringing plays little to no role in how you develop as an adult. On the other end of the spectrum, on the nurture side, people argue that everybody's born a blank slate, which is a concept also known as tabula rasa, which is an idea dating back to Aristotle, who was probably the first to write about the idea. But essentially, advocates of nurture over nature would argue that your genetics don't matter at all, and all that matters is your environment and how you're raised. It's a very egalitarian concept, and it sounds good in theory, but it's also very naive. Really, I think the vast majority of people would agree that the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Obviously, your genetics do play a role. I mean, just think if you're raised in a first world country with proper nutrition and you only grow up to be 5 feet 3 inches tall as an adult male, that's genetic. That's purely genetic. And being that short is going to affect both how other people treat you, and it's going to affect how you yourself interact with the world around you. Likewise, being born with a low IQ, for example, is pretty much the same thing. It's mostly just genetic. Some people could have all the best private tutoring in the world, the best nutrition, the best schooling, and everything else, and still end up with below average intelligence just because they were born with a certain genetic code. So it's obvious that genetics do play a role. Denying genetics is just denying reality. However, I really don't think genetics is everything. I mean, it can be in a sense, like if you're just born exceptionally short and exceptionally ugly as a man, then yeah, in that case, your upbringing and childhood experiences probably won't change whether or not you grow up to be involuntarily celibate. You just really have no chance to begin with. But the simple fact of the matter is that not every involuntarily celibate man is exceptionally ugly or exceptionally short or exceptionally mentally ill or anything like that. A whole lot of involuntarily celibate men appear average or maybe just slightly below average in terms of looks, and sometimes maybe even slightly above average. Although I do think there is a point where a guy can be naturally attractive enough that it is pretty much impossible for him to not get laid at some point. But genetically speaking, most men do fit somewhere within the average range in terms of looks, in terms of intelligence, and in terms of mental health. Yet, plenty of average men are celibate involuntarily. So, why is that? Well, if it's not genetics, because we are talking about average men, and some average men do manage to have a relatively fulfilling romantic life, while others do not. So, if the difference isn't genetics, then it must be nurture. It must be that certain men have certain life experiences or they grow up in a certain environment that makes it exceptionally unlikely for them to ever be able to attract a woman. So that's what I want to talk about today. And I'm sorry for the long preamble, but I wanted to make sure that I'm being as clear as possible. So I think it was important to start off by acknowledging that yes, some men are involuntarily celibate pretty much just because of their genetics. So I'm not denying the fact that some men really are just exceptionally unattractive. But the main purpose of this video, I want to go over some of the main things, some of the key life experiences and environmental factors that can cause an otherwise average or even above average man to end up perpetually lonely, involuntarily celibate. I'm not going to bury the lead. Most of the experiences and environmental factors I'm going to be talking about here are things that can cause high inhibition, because high inhibition is the reason why so many average men cannot find love. And if you don't know what high inhibition is, it's basically just another way of saying social anxiety, or in other words, being shy. Of course, whatever level of inhibition a person has is at least partially due to genetic factors. Some people are just naturally very high inhibition, and some people are naturally just very low inhibition. But there's also a whole lot of guys that are genetically average in terms of inhibition, but their level of inhibition increases over time due to their life experiences. So, what kind of environmental factors or life experiences make a man have social anxiety or high inhibition? One big factor that I think a lot of involuntarily celibate men have in common is that they grew up with overbearing parents that never really let them speak for themselves. As a young child, you need to actively practice socializing in different varied situations, because if you don't, then you won't develop social skills. And as you get older, when you start going to school and working, and you're forced into more and more social situations where you have to act independently, your mother isn't going to be there to speak for you anymore, you will continually keep having more and more awkward social moments where you make some kind of mistake, some little faux pas or whatever, and you see people react negatively, and you internalize that. It just keeps building and building over time and snowballing, and it's just a negative feedback loop. It's extremely difficult to break out of that cycle. So, for most average-looking, mentally average men, if your mom or your dad is always speaking for you, never letting you speak for yourself, and they're just always taking the lead in any social situation you're involved in, what's happening is that they're not giving you any opportunities to make those social mistakes early on when you're young, and everybody expects you to be making those mistakes. So you're not getting the opportunity to learn and improve on your social skills in the correct time frame, when you're young. So it ends up happening, like I said, you get older, and eventually you will end up in more and more situations where your parents aren't there to save you, and your social skills are so underdeveloped, you just keep making a fool of yourself. And every time that happens, and you see somebody give you a weird look or whatever, you can't help but internalize that. You see the result of your actions is essentially a punishment. So you just learn that if I try to socialize, I get punished. I receive negative feedback every time. So obviously, in that situation, you are going to develop a fear of social interaction. And that's what high inhibition is. As men, we are expected to be the initiators. If you don't actively pursue women, unless you are a highly attractive man yourself, you're not going to find a girlfriend if you don't actively approach women. You're not going to have any kind of romantic interactions whatsoever as an average man if you do not take charge and initiate it yourself. And even then, you do have to have good social skills. And men that are high inhibition also don't have good social skills. You can't have good social skills if you are high inhibition. It's not possible. So it's not something you can just power through momentarily. That won't work. You can't fake it till you make it, because it doesn't work. It doesn't work like that. Your social skills won't be good enough for you to actually succeed if you tried to, fake it till you make it. You can't just power through this. Another common experience I think a lot of cells have in common is that they grew up with parents that would mock them frequently, or maybe not necessarily mocking, but they had parents that would, in one way or another, make them feel stupid or inferior for whatever they said. This is something that I personally experienced growing up. It wasn't usually mocking, but my mom and dad would both always act like I'm retarded or something whenever I would say something as a kid. And at least half the time, I wasn't even saying anything stupid. They just didn't actually understand what I was saying. And even in cases where I was saying something stupid, I was a kid. So obviously I'm going to be saying something stupid. And actually, there was someone else in my life that was way worse about mocking me than either of my parents were, but I don't really want to talk about that in this video. But I'm sure it goes without saying, if you grow up just constantly being made to feel like a fool anytime you share your opinion, especially if this is happening in your own home, of course you're going to end up with social anxiety. That's a no-brainer. So being belittled in your own home as a kid just for your typical thoughts and opinions, it's a clear stepping stone toward perpetual loneliness. Another common experience for lonely men is that they just weren't around a lot of other kids when they were growing up. Usually that's because of being homeschooled or maybe going to a small private school that just doesn't have a lot of students. This one kinda applies to me because I did attend a small private school when I was younger, but I did also play sports, so I don't know. I wouldn't really say I was never around other kids, but I have met people that were homeschooled, and I mean, if you've ever met anyone that was homeschooled, then you already know being homeschooled is like an incubator for becoming the weirdest possible version of yourself. And it's actually a twofold problem because the lack of social interaction with peers is enough to make someone develop social anxiety, because just think about it. If you don't actually have a lot of personal experience to go off of, then how would you learn the cause and effect of social interaction? Well, you might be influenced by things you see on TV, or these days, what you see on social media. And as we all know, the social interactions depicted on TV and social media are like flamboyantly dramatic. So if you don't have your own data points to go off of, you might just think real life social interaction is like what you see on TV. And that definitely might make you afraid to socialize. So that's one way that being homeschooled can give you social anxiety. But there's also the fact that if you're that socially isolated from your peers, you just couldn't possibly gain an accurate understanding of what other people your age are like. You won't be aware of all the pop culture and the slang and just the way that other kids are. When homeschool kids interact with normal kids, It's a lot like when a first world anthropologist makes contact with an Amazonian tribe. They just can't really communicate on the same level. So when a homeschooler does get that rare opportunity to actually interact with some of his same age peers, it is highly likely that what ends up happening is he'll just be acting really weird in some way, and he'll receive negative feedback from that interaction. As in, he'll have a bad, painful experience. He'll get made fun of, or he'll get weird looks, or whatever. But, whatever it is, he will receive some sort of negative feedback. And it all just compounds on itself. So being homeschooled, and in some cases just living in a very rural area where there's not a lot of other kids at your school, that is something that can lead to high inhibition. And we all know where that leads. Loneliness. Celibacy. Involuntarily. Just real quick, I wanted to say, if you've made it this far into the video, and especially if you've watched like several of my other videos and you're not subscribed, I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe, or maybe just like the video or leave a comment. Anyways, the next life experience I want to talk about that often leads to involuntary celibacy is ugly duckling syndrome. So basically, if you're really ugly as a kid, or maybe not even facially ugly, but even if you're just kind of fat or something, which, by the way, if a kid is fat, that's usually not the kid's fault. It's the parent's fault. But anyways, a lot of people are unattractive when they're younger, and then they glow up, so to speak. Maybe they got braces and fixed their teeth, or they lost a lot of weight, or whatever. But whatever the case is, some men that look average or even above average now might have been a lot less attractive or even ugly when they were younger. And being unattractive for any reason as a child is something that obviously can lead to negative social experiences, which can lead to social anxiety, high inhibition. So being an ugly duckling is a life experience that I think a lot of the more attractive lonely men have in common. And this is one I had too. I've mentioned before how for a very short period of time in my later teen years, I was actually kind of good looking. But when I was younger, younger than that, growing up, I was fat. I don't even think I was ever obese, although I might have been pretty close at my peak, but I was fat enough that it really hurt my self-esteem. And I do think that definitely contributed to the severe social anxiety I currently experience as an adult. Even by the time I was 17 or 18, when I started to be good looking for once in my life, it was already too late for me at that point. My social anxiety was already out of control. A common saying you might see in the comments if you watch this channel or other similar channels, people always say, it was over before it ever even began. And that really rings true for a lot of us in this position because, like in my case, I had already developed crippling social anxiety by the time I was like 9 or 10. And pretty much anything that happens to you in life up to that point, it's not really your own fault because, you're a kid. So in a sense, it is over before it even began. Because by the time you develop high inhibition or whatever other mental problems you have, you're usually already too far gone before you even reach an age where you have any real agency. It's brutal. It's really unfair. Okay, so the next foundational experience I want to talk about that causes a man to become an inkwell is growing up in a situation where you are of a different class, so to speak, in some way, compared to everyone else around you. Or if there's just something about your life situation that's easy for bullies to target. So, for example, if you're living in poverty, but somehow you end up on scholarship at some fancy boarding school or something, so you yourself are really, really poor, but everyone else around you is really, really rich. Or say you're a Bangladeshi or something like that, and you're growing up in an area where it's like 99% of people are Japanese. Or maybe you got two gay dads and you're growing up in the middle of the Bible Belt. Anything like that where there's just something about you that's very easy for other kids to pick out and bully you about. It's not necessarily a sure thing that it is going to happen, but there is a pretty good chance that you might get bullied pretty badly by your peers. And I mean, if you're like really good looking or really good at sports or something, then you might be able to overcome that, or people might not even really mess with you at all in that case. But for an average looking, average in every way type of guy, that sort of easy to pick on life situation can easily lead you down a path toward high inhibition, which, as I've already said time and time again, can make it extremely difficult or even impossible to ever find love. Or not even love, but to ever even find any kind of romantic connection whatsoever, even if only for one night. You know, it when you have extremely high inhibition, extremely bad social anxiety, it almost, I'm not going to say it doesn't matter at all how good looking you are, because yes, if you're like Chad level of good looks, then yes, it doesn't matter what your personality is like. Nothing matters if you're that good looking. Women will just throw themselves at you. But if you're anything below that, I mean, if you're sub 8, and I don't even mean that as an exaggeration. If you are sub 8 and you have very high inhibition, it is going to be very difficult for you to ever find any kind of romantic connection with a woman. Because, like I say, what it all boils down to, men are expected to initiate any and all romantic situations. And that's not always the case. I mean, women do initiate romantic interactions all the time, but not with anyone that is anything other than extremely attractive. Chad level, 8 out of 10 and higher. So, just to give a quick summary, a few of the key life experiences that a lot of us faced in our childhood and our younger years that have led us to become involuntarily celibate men, some of those things are being raised by overbearing parents that never let you speak for yourselves, growing up with parents that mock you or belittle you whenever you say anything, being homeschooled or possibly just being from a rural area where essentially you're just not around a lot of peers of your same age, that's something that can lead to high inhibition. Growing up unattractive, ugly duck syndrome. And finally, growing up with any sort of life situation where there's just some kind of life situation you're in that puts a very easy target on your back for everyone around you to pick on you and bully you and, just just give you a lot of negative feedback on social interactions.